Hi, it's Miss Blanchard. I just thought I'd do a couple review videos since I will be out of class for the next, well, for certain days this week doing test proctoring for other tests. So I thought I'd start with a video on the tail end of period 5 because none of the classes got that far. This is a test, so I hope you're supposed to be able to see ultimately my screen and me. I just got out of the shower and my very messy home office is behind me. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. We're going to start with Key Concept 5.3 on page 62 of the Key Concepts down here. Okay, so Key Concept 5.3, the Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issue of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. So that was like at the beginning of the year when we did the in-class debate on like Reconstruction. That's what it's saying. The Civil War settled the issue, but of Southern secession, they can't. Slavery, we can't. But left questions about African Americans and how states and the federal government should relate. Those are kind of unsettled. So number one here, the North's greater manpower and industrial resource, the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and others, and the decisions to emphasize decision to emancipate slaves eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. So I think one or two classes got to A, and some of the other classes I just tried to mention it. And if you look at A here, both the Union and Confederacy mobilized their economies and society to wage war, even while facing considerable opposition on the home front. If you look at why the North eventually wins the Civil War, it's because of period 4. Everything that we covered in the one review session on period 4, it's industrialization. We have boot-making factories. We have metalwork factories in the North, and because of the transportation revolution, we can get things that are made in, like, for instance, Massachusetts has the biggest boot making factory in the United States. We can make boots for Union soldiers, but then the rail lines, canals, navigable rivers can get those products then to the front where soldiers actually need them. So I know I said in class before the Civil War you really can't talk about railroads. The main railroad, though, is a north-south railroad. It's there wasn't a lot of rail lines. I think the number is like less than 10,000 miles, which actually isn't a lot. But there's like one main rail line that cotton would go be taken up to the north on, and then return for more cotton. And so there actually is a convenient rail line that feeds. I think if you look at a map, I think it's like today what would be I-95, the I-95 corridor that if you ever drive down to Florida, it kind of takes you on the coast there. And there's really only one railroad, and it's not old, but we could also send things down using the rivers because you have the steamboat power to get the steamboats back up and get a return trip. And then also the Industrial Revolution. You have new ways of producing food, so we can feed those armies, we can feed soldiers' families who are left in the North. So all of that Industrial Revolution comes to lead to a Union victory. And it says, even while facing considerable opposition on the home front. So in the North, that's mainly the like the Copperhead movement. The Copperheads, like a Copperhead snake, are the people that attacked Lincoln for various reasons, a lot of very racist reasons. And Lincoln responds by more or less just imprisoning them and putting them in jail for the duration of the war. I don't know, I actually didn't bother to look at the framework if it mentions this later, but that's, if you remember from last year, Ex parte Merriman and Ex parte Milligan. That Ex parte Merriman is imprisoning people without habeas corpus, show me the body, bringing them and having formal charges against them. And then Ex parte Milligan is taking civilians but trying them in military tribunals, which is something the British did before the American Revolution. We hated it. But here's Lincoln doing it again. Both cases, Taney says it's illegal and Lincoln can't, but it's up to the executive to execute those Supreme Court decisions. And the fact it pretty much comes at the end of the war, by the time the Supreme Court makes a decision, kind of makes it a moot point. Okay, moving on. B. Lincoln and most Union supporters began the Civil War to preserve the Union, but Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the purpose of the war and helped prevent the Confederacy from gaining full diplomatic support from European powers. Okay, so first of all, Lincoln and most Union supporters began the Civil War to preserve the Union, right? They're free soilers, right? Lincoln was not the great emancipator until really 1862, 1863. People in his cabinet were abolitionists, and they push him. And I think as the war drags on, he, slowly comes around to this. In the Great Awakening, Lincoln is actually, I think, he's Dutch Reform. His parents were Dutch Reform. Lincoln is much more of, he's not so religious, but he does have that Dutch Reform idea that, like, kind of we're all God's people. And so I think through the war he kind of begins to accept that more, that slaves, are humans. So then let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation, there's actually 3 of them. He issues the first one after the Battle of Antietam. That's why Antietam is the biggest single day battle of the war, but the importance is it's a big enough victory for the North, because we kind of been having our butts handed to us up until then, that Lincoln can issue this Emancipation Proclamation. And he says any slaves in territories under rebellion, if they don't come back to the Union, will be freed. So the problem is places like West Virginia will secede from Virginia and come back to the Union to keep their slaves. So they had left the Union, they come back, they get to keep their slaves. Places like Missouri are not in rebellion. Same with Maryland, are slave states that are not in rebellion, but because they're not in rebellion, their slaves don't get freed. And slaves in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, they are in rebellion, but they form their own country. So a president can't really enact a law over another country. They see themselves as a different country, legally, whether they are or not. So for all intents and purposes, the slaves aren't going to be freed. They're still going to be working under their Southern masters. So the Emancipation Proclamation, that's what the second part of this gets into, is for Lincoln, he changes the war, the purpose of the war, from preserving the Union to a war about slavery. And what that does is, especially France and Britain were already abolitionist countries. I want to say France ended slavery with the French Revolution. I think it was a little bit later in some of the colonies, but in France there was no more slavery after the French Revolution. And England ended slavery in, I want to say the 1830s, I think 1833. So they have really strong abolitionist movements, and the South had been trading with them their cotton, and this basically forces England and France's hands by saying, if you continue trading with the South, you're basically supporting slavery. And so it gets that end, the blockade, gets France and Britain to kind of step back from trading with the South, and basically strangles the South economically. They don't produce anything other than cotton, right? That's their part of the Triple Revolution, is they're a monocrop economy on cotton. And now if they can't sell it, they can't do anything with it, they can't make money from it, they don't have the means to process it, so it's going to strangle the South. So the Emancipation Proclamation is, more than anything, a diplomatic measure to try and defeat the South than it is really about freeing any slaves. It's a moral cause for the North. It's a rallying cry for Northern abolitionists to support the war, but it's also very much a diplomatic measure. Okay. Next, part of just B, many African Americans fled Southern plantations and enlisted in the Union Army, helping to undermine the Confederacy. And these people are called contraband. If you want to go more in depth in it, I can tell you all about it. But basically, it's a legal maneuvering of abolitionists that takes the South and says, fine, South, you want slaves to be property? Okay. Under commonly accepted principles of warfare, property confiscated during war can be used by the confiscators. So any places that the Union Army goes into, we're going to confiscate your property of slaves and allow them to be soldiers. The South, of course, doesn't like this, but nobody cares. Okay. Yeah, that's about. Okay, so let's go into C. Lincoln sought to reunify the country and used speeches such as the Gettysburg Address to portray the struggle against slavery as the fulfillment of America's founding democratic ideals. Gettysburg Address is short, but it does that, trying to unify us into one common cause. I would also say the Emancipation Proclamation does the same thing. And Lincoln's second inaugural address, he echoes the same ideas of unifying the country. So if you hear Lincoln speaking throughout the war, he'll never be bashing the South. He's constantly saying, we need to come together, and he's including the South in that. And then D, although the Confederacy showed military initiative and daring early in the war, they have the much better leaders. Their culture leading into the war valued military service for affluent families. So but really all of our military leadership in 1859 were Southerners. So when they leave, the North didn't really have much leadership. The Union ultimately seceded due to improvements in leadership and strategy. So much of that is the hiring. When Lincoln fires Winfield Scott in the very beginning, he's only in charge of the Northern War effort for like 3 or 4 months, and we hire blanking here. McClellan, General McClellan. He's from New Jersey. In fact, his wife's estate is actually, he's not from New Jersey, but he later lived in New Jersey. He's a railroad tycoon who became rich, and the railroads, but his wife's estate now makes up a considerable portion, I think, of the Seton Hall campus. Anyway, McClellan takes soldiers out of the field for like several months and just makes them learn how to march so they can more effectively fight. And then, we got a little interruption. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. But McClellan kind of gets too big for britches. He wants to challenge Lincoln. He wants to be the president. He runs against him in 1964. So he's fired, and then we hire Ulysses S. Grant, and we have William Tecumseh Sherman, who's in charge of the armies in the South. We have, through the course of the war, Lincoln struggles to find a general, and by the end of the war has good leadership in Grant and Sherman. And then it says key victories, so Gettysburg, Antietam in 62, Gettysburg, the day after Gettysburg on July 4th is the Battle of Vicksburg, where we get to Mississippi. So important key victories. Greater resources, like I said, period 4 in the Triple Revolution, and the wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. So one thing that is evilly genius, William Tecumseh Sherman, is his march to the sea. He burns Atlanta, and then he marches to the Atlantic Ocean and kind of burns everything in his path. So by burning these things, he destroys the South's, Atlanta, it's a large hub. He destroys their food source in the field and destroys their morale. So let's move on because I only have a couple minutes left. How much more do we have? Okay, I'll try and be brief. So number 2, Reconstruction of the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationships between the states and federal governments, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. Okay, so 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th and 15th Amendments granted African American citizenship. So they had to have the 14th Amendment because Taney and the Dred Scott decision had basically said slaves weren't citizens, so that gives them citizenship and is supposed to give them the full rights of citizenships. You know what? I'm going to stop this here because I'm going to get cut off in a minute, and I'll be back with another.